Hello and good evening from Frankfurt, from the German Architecture Museum to our 8th session of Kontext, Kontinuität, Kontext, the last time. Excellent, good start. And I am very happy to welcome you to this online session of our wonderful series discussing cultural heritage and urban development. How does that fit together? Where are the tensions? And how do we proceed with everything? Tonight's topic is the evolvement of modernism and its perception in society today. So we're leaving a little bit of noise, Frankfurt and Tel Aviv probably behind, and discuss the big picture. And I'm really happy to welcome 4 speakers tonight. I have here in the Dam with me Oliver Elser, our curator, and also currently interim professor of architecture theory in Karlsruhe. I welcome Inbal Ben Asher Gitler from Tel Aviv, from ICOMOS Israel, and senior lecturer at the Sapir Academic College. My English is rusty today, isn't it? And then I welcome Zvi Efrat, architect and architectural historian, also to participate in our discussion tonight. And as 4th speaker, we have Feyyaz Berber, an architect from Cologne, the young generation, I'd say. And I'm happy to also see Iran Mordovovic already here, participating later in the discussion. We have, as always, you have always the possibility, if you have any comments or questions during the discussion, and you are in Zoom, participating in Zoom, then you can either write the question or comment in the chat or Q&A, or you can ask us that we can promote you to panelists and you would become visible and become part of the discussion. That's for the formalities, of course. For those in Germany who collect Fortbildungspunkte, I hope you all join from Zoom. If not, you can still do that, and you can get 1 point for the Architektenkammer Fortbildungspunkte. I am really happy to have you here. It's still a bit exciting to be online, and as I said before, I hope we can, as a next step, which has not been scheduled, a real life event here in Frankfurt. But to start now, I hand over to Oliver to introduce his side of the topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea. I have brought with me some slides, which should start in a second. Yes, here we go. Well, when this last talk was announced, there was a kind of subtitle or further description that said we will talk about the kind of evolvement from modernism over brutalism, international style, and postmodernism. And so I thought that we should, from the start on, or that might be my contribution, question this concept a bit. Because when you look closer, then you see more than these kind of simple descriptions and more than these cliches of a white modernism and so on. And I start with Ernst May in Frankfurt, which is indeed a white modernism, but at the same time we had Martin Elsässer, which is here. The Wholesale Market Hall, also in Frankfurt, which is a brick building and has also strong references to expressionist architecture. And only a few years before, one of the most progressive foundings in the not only in Frankfurt, but I would say in the whole university scene, was the Institute for Social Research. A group of scholars founded this rather progressive and Marxist oriented research institute, and they have chosen Franz Röckle as their architect, and he in 1924 built this kind of castle-like completely unusual architecture when you think of the New Frankfurt or White Modernism. But it happened almost at the same time, and it was not a conservative client, but a deeply progressive client. This goes on when you go to the post-war architecture, or what you could then call international style. We have a couple of great examples here in Frankfurt. This is a theater building of ABB architects, which was or still is endangered of demolition. And then you have this kind of this type of architecture. You can ask if it's brutalism or not. This is the German Federal Bank, 1972, also by ABB, an office that is in our collection. So we have the estate of ABB and made an exhibition about this. And only a short anecdote to this, because the German Federal Bank, they have asked us some years ago if they have a brutalist building. So they and we didn't know exactly why they had asked us that question. And they were, and then it came out that they want to have a brutalist building because they want to participate in this kind of brutalist hype. And somehow we had to disappoint them. And we said, well, it's made out of concrete, it's made out of prefab concrete elements, but it lacks this kind of over exaggeration, this kind of strong sculptural form, what we call in our initiative, I will maybe talk later about it a bit more, as the rhetoric of brutalism. And this is, I would say, it's a kind of brutalism, but it's more related to an international style building. It's a bit like the elegance of Mies van der Rohe in concrete. But we had brutalism in Frankfurt, which is all gone. Here you see a building for the City Museum, for the Historical Museum of Frankfurt, that was demolished in 2011. And nobody has ever noticed that. I mean, some people would have, but it was not widely known in public that there was a connection between the construction of this facade and the timber frame building on the other side of the street. Yeah, and then a really important era in architecture in Frankfurt was the postmodern, or you can also question if it's called second modernity. For international speakers, this is a newspaper clipping from 1981. It says, first prize for giantism. So it's much overdone, thought the more leftist-oriented Frankfurter Rundschau when it was when the competition was decided. And at the same time, we have, so you could also say this is a kind of, I mean, our founding director called this a kind of ghost-like Le Corbusier, a kind of zombie Le Corbusier building, which is a bit harsh to Richard Meyer, I would say. But at the same time, we have this really pure postmodernist building from Hans Hollein. But you can ask yourself if this year of 1984, the year our museum opened, it brings two rather opposite high-rise buildings. One you see the Deutsche Bank, also by ABB. You see it's a kind of great office, great practice for Frankfurt, and of Oswald Matthias Ungers. This really, without any doubts, postmodern idea to have this kind of volumes into another, and this kind of gatehouse, the tour house of the fair. Yeah, so this just as from the Frankfurt perspective, a kind of overview what happened, and that it was never any kind of pure style that happened one after another. So yeah, thank you.
One question before we continue: is any one of those buildings under monument protection?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure about. I mean, you mean both of them, the high rises?
Are they?
I don't think so. No, I think the Ungers is still not heritage protected, and what is quite remarkable is that the Deutsche Bank building, the twin towers, so to say, of Frankfurt, they were restored only, I would say, 5 years ago by the Deutsche Bank, and they kept. It was no monument protection, but they kept the facade, this kind of sunglass facade. They kept it as accurate as they could because they knew that they had an icon. I mean, this building was about, I counted it once, it was about 10 times on the cover of the Spiegel magazine. So it was kind of, it is a symbol of German post-war capitalism. And they knew it. I mean, they are also the evil ones, I would say, in some respect, but they knew that they have an icon there.
Excellent. Thank you, Oliver, for this presentation. I think that we have plenty of things to talk about later on, but now I would like to invite Inbal to share her, let's say, impulse for our discussion tonight. We can see the presentation, Inbal. It's just not yet in presentation mode.
Thank you, Andrea. I lost my mute button there for a moment, so I was looking for that. Okay. It's in presentation mode right now, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So in connecting also to the theme of this evening's panel and to what Oliver just presented, I was thinking about the question that we posed and the statement that we opened with, which was that understanding modernism and postmodernism as mere opposites falls short of all these complications that you could already see right now, you know, with all these questions. What is modernism? Did it indeed die sometime in the 70s? What was late modernism or the international style, etc.? And in Israel, I think as the more we delve into it, the more we see how potent these questions are in Tel Aviv and all over Israel as well. And I actually wanted to start on the presentation on a personal note. I had been, as a young woman, quite a few years in the United States. And the first time I ever went to Europe was after writing a seminar paper about the Angewandte Kunst, the Museum of Applied Arts, or Arts and Crafts, that Oliver just showed. And that was like the first time I ever went to Europe. That's what I wanted to see, you know, the postmodernism. It was already beginning to be famous and an icon with a famous architect. And I'm comparing it here to a building that was built only 4 years afterwards, the University Gallery of Tel Aviv University. I think it was one of the first postmodernist, you know, pure postmodernist iterations in the, you know, Mayer and Sterling style. And you can see it here with the white grid and the pinkish colors. And the questions that I think arise from this is that we know and we talk a lot about postmodernism having a point of reference in the past, whereas I think we can see it in the museum in Frankfurt, that there are some references to the past. And in the Israeli example, there are a few round pillars and perhaps some iterations of maybe even postmodernism's discourse with classicism, and etc. And it's really interesting, I think, these two interpretations in Frankfurt and in Tel Aviv of this thing we call postmodernism, which we're trying to question today. And one of the things that I think should be asked, or that might even help us to better understand why it's so problematic to say, when does modernism stop? Did it die? Is because modernism also has a lot of references to the past. It was at some points and by some architects discussed as a very pure and international style. But when we go, for example, to brutalism, and I want to briefly show you one example of Israeli brutalism, we see that there are references to the past, and we see that there are references to issues of symbolism, and Zvi will also talk about that later. So here, for example, we have the Negev Center in Beersheba, which was planned by Ram Karmi, and there's a lot to say about the rhetorics of brutalism with regard to this building, but I wanted to open our panel when discussing this building with its references to the past, with its references to locality. And I think what is interesting in this brutalist building, this is a black and white photo, but it's complete. It's almost completely built of exposed concrete with some silicate bricks and a little bit of white paint. What's interesting about this building is that Karmi, even in his writings, made a lot of references to heritage, to locality, to issues that are Israeli in the search for an Israeli brutalism. In this section, you can see that there is a passage. I'm purposely not saying passage because he didn't really see it as a passage, but there is a passage with shops and offices and apartments on the upper level. And you can see here that it's well shaded from the desert sun, because Beersheba is a really, really desert town, and the climate is a very arid climate. But when Karmi discusses this building in an introduction he made to it in 1965, he refers to it as something that reminisces the Israeli Rangers tent, which was a tent used by army units before and after the establishment of the state of Israel. And he also refers to it as a bazaar, which goes more towards the Middle Eastern market or shuk. And we have here two really important references that I think are an excellent example of appropriation, because the Middle Eastern bazaar at this point with Israeli architecture was something appropriated from Islamic architecture, from the Islamic cities. And the Israeli Rangers tent is something, I think, a search for something more Israeli, and Zvi might want to, comment on that later, but it's referenced. So I think a lot of the discussions about brutalism usually talk about rhetoric and exposed concrete, and more recently we also talk about the social context, which are very important. But we do see here a kernel of relating to regionality and relating to place and trying to find traditions. In Israel especially, I think it's related to issues of the nation state, that you try and define what the state is all about, and you look for new symbolism in the vein of what Anderson called an imagined community, that you try to create symbols and you do it through, in this case, brutalism. One more comparison he made, which is the final point in his regional approach here, is a comparison to the Arab village. He was talking about the contrasts of light and shade in the Mediterranean region in general, and he himself included this sketch when he talked about architecture of shade and presented this building. He made a comparison as far as lighting goes to what actually happens when in the really, really bright sun, you have these cubicle forms of the Arab village. And so I thought this could bring an interesting, aspect to exactly this question of what is brutalism, and how we defined it in relation to all these questions about the discourses of architectures in the 20th century. Per your question earlier, Andrea, as far as I know, the building has been listed in the local heritage list of the city of Beersheba. recently some new apartments with shops underneath have been built, and they completely obscure the building from the street. This is what I just showed you, the huge, very, very elaborate and strong sort of concrete building is now hidden by these white apartment buildings. I don't have a lot of good things to say about it, because I think there should have been much more respect to Carmi's plans for a street facade. I don't think you have to do it by the letter, but I think obliterating it in such a form, I have a lot of critical things to say about this choice. But at least, again, it has been listed, so hopefully the other parts that are still a bit more evident towards the streets might be preserved and approached differently, although unfortunately I must say this is not the plan. So anyways, this is just to set the stage with a few more questions about the issues that we're discussing today, and thank you.
Thank you, Inbal. I think what you said about respect, I think that's a good point for our discussion later on. What is respect? And respecting the evolvement of the different styles means for us today, and what can it be in the future? Zvi, you would be next for giving an impulse into our discussion, and I would be really curious what.
Okay. We can just your last words, respect and evolvement of styles. I can begin with this, but respect to whom, or disrespect, or total blindness to certain issues that is always necessary in order to do what you do. And then what is the evolvement of styles, which I will call here historiography. So my take will be on historiography and or about the writing or the looking at history, just because I decided to give up, decided ahead of time that I give up my slides for Fayaz, because he has more slides. And this is something very Israeli, because we always sell air rights. We sell actually what we don't have. And it has to do with preservation and with history, in architectural history, because if we don't have air rights, because we're to preserve a building, we can transfer it to somewhere else. So that's what I did with Fayaz. So I'll just talk, and I'll try to be, because I'm not visual today, I will try to a bit radicalize my statement. I'll try by saying that the evolvement of styles, as you call it, or the proper way to do historiography, to do history of architecture, is perhaps necessary as a kind of a preliminary, as an infrastructure, intellectual infrastructure, as a preliminary gesture, just to periodize and to say one style begins here and ends here, and then it's replaced by another style and so on. But then again, it's apparently completely not useful, at least if you live long enough. So you may be a historian like myself, for example. If you're old enough, you do both. You do periodization, okay? So you describe the evolvement of styles, okay? And then you take it all apart. And this is basically the story of my own writing. And now in Israel, or the history of Zionism, or the Zionist enterprise, so-called, is very interesting because it's such an extreme showcase of 20th century national movement, and a national movement that relies so much on planning and architecture. So there's nothing there that is not done by design, by planning. And architects play a central role from the beginning until today, of course. So it's a very interesting kind of exaggerated or exacerbated case study of 20th century modernism, postmodernism, brutalism, what have you. And it's very tempting and very easy to do periodization. So I can say that in the 1880s and 1890s, we see something very particular. Let's call it, I don't know, French colonial or in general kind of a rural or semi-rural colonial architecture. And then you see in the teens and 20s what here we call eclectic style, which is actually an attempt to somehow crystallize what they called a Hebrew style or a Hebrew language for architecture, but it's a mix of different kind of Orientalism and Jugendstil and other things. And then in the 30s and 40s, we see suddenly what in retrospect we call Bauhaus, which is very strange because until 1930, more or less, the year 1930, more or less, there's no modernism whatsoever. Nothing. Maybe a building here and a building there, but there's no modernism here in Palestine, on the land of what we call the Eretz Israel. Not at all. And from 1930 on, you will not see anything that is not modernist, which is amazing. So this is what I mean by an exacerbated kind of case study of architecture plays a really an important role in expressing something. How can you explain it? And this is something really that doesn't happen anywhere else. That suddenly, in a clear cut, it's like in a film, you know, you do cuts, and you move from one culture to a totally different culture. And I'm talking about a very heterogeneous situation because there's an urban situation, say Tel Aviv or Haifa, and there is a rural situation which is extremely important in those years. And both in the rural and in the urban or semi-urban, you see the same appropriation of what we will later call Bauhaus or modernist style or styles, okay? And you see it from on the left and on the right. There is a very strong left architecture, especially in the rural, but also in the cities. Let's say the disciples of Hannes Meyer, okay, in Israel, kind of the socialists, the Marxists. See, but there's also something else, which is the majority, kind of the bourgeois architecture, certainly in the cities, in Tel Aviv and so on. But they use more or less the same kind of paradigm or the same, let's call it the same look, okay, which is also strange. So this is the 30s and 40s. And then there is the 50s and 60s, which is something very else. Now it's a different situation. Before that, it was kind of a pre-state situation. Now we are in a state, in the state of Israel, in the formative decades, the 50s and 60s, we have again a very, very blatant and exaggerated use of, let's call it international style, for a lack of a better word, or for a lack of time to further explain it. But it's both top down and bottom up. Basically top down because it's the state and the state organizations, the workers' unions and so on, they all choose to use the language of, let's call it international style. But during the 60s already, we see something else coming up. This is the brutalism that the former speakers were talking about and Inbal was presenting. And brutalism in Israel is again exaggerated because it is now rhetorically staged as a national style. So it's not a marginal phenomenon, a building here or there, but it becomes basically everything. So we see most of the public buildings, but also the little private architecture. And again, urban and rural, we see brutalism everywhere. And it signifies something. It has, it resonates, it has a meaning for the people. And of course, it's sort of, in a very funny way, personified. Is something that is both originary or original, coming from the place, as Inbal said, okay? So it's local, and it's Israeli, or what we call the tzaba or sabre. So it was personified as the figure or the character, the rough and direct and sincere character of the Israeli and of this model state, the new model state of Israel. And then we see in the 70s and 80s, we see again very, very strong tendency, certainly in certain places in Israel, to a move to postmodern architecture, and we see the same architects, same modernist and postmodernist architects doing now postmodern architecture with a very strong sense of history. And it has all a lot to do, in my opinion, not so much with kind of world fashions, but also a lot to do with local events, and certainly with the occupation of the old city, for example, of Jerusalem, and so on. So we see totally new trends that were not possible 10 or 15 years ago, suddenly taking a central place in the Israeli architectural scene, especially this notion of preservation. Okay, now my point is this, because I see that I'm too long already, so I'll just try to make a long story very, very short. My point is this: 2 points, okay, 2 important points. One is that modern architecture or modernist architecture, and I'm talking about kind of pre-war modernism, but also post-war modernism, once it's out of its very little comfortable shell or case as an avant-garde, which was the case in Europe in the 20s, say, and it becomes a popular language, a spoken language, a popular architecture. It becomes an architecture of immigrants or an exiled architecture. And I think you can see it not only in Israel, you can see it also in the States or in England or in North Africa and so on. Once it becomes all over the place, it's spread, okay? And this is the only possible language. Then it becomes also multiple. Then what we see is not anymore a pure form of modernism, this kind of elite or avant-garde architecture, but we see many dialects. And when we see this, and we see this pluralism, this is what we see basically secondary or derivative architecture. And this situation basically allows us to say, and I really make it very short now, to call it, from our perspective today, something that is very close to postmodern architecture, or very eclectic architecture, okay? So what we call Bauhaus in Israel is basically a very eclectic, multiple dialects and styles that has very little to do with these original notions of Bauhaus. This is one point. The other point is that what allows us, okay, to see this multiplicity again as a style, or to brand it as a Bauhaus, is basically postmodernism. The moment that this kind of multiple modernisms are appreciated, in Israel at least, is in the 80s and 90s. During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you know, it's totally neglected or demolished. And there's a certain moment where there's a surge of a sense of history. Part of this history could be a deep history, you know, the Palestinian history basically, or a Crusaders history or Roman history, but it could be also kind of this 20s history or 30s history. And then this is the moment when modern architecture is both being valued and preserved, and we begin to discuss it as a under kind of unifying terms. So okay, I'll finish here, but the point is that history, you know, simple periodization is useful as a beginning, but once we look closer at it, you know, it's totally unuseful, and we have to see it in a deeper context. I think in Israel, and this is my last statement, I think that in Israel, the political context, and with the political context comes the ethical context, is what allows us to claim certain claims, like, for example, the brutalist claims for locality or for being indigenous. But this is also what allows us as historians or as interpreters of this history to negate, or at least to take apart this kind of simple claims.
Thank you, Sri. That's many points we shall discuss further. I put a few notes down on this. And I think that's a good ending for starting with Fejas, who's interpreting and showing us two of his buildings as another impulse into our discussion. So over to Fejas, to Cologne. Hello to Cologne.
Okay. Hi. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. I'm gonna share.
You're very welcome. Yes, that works so far, and then it's just a.
Now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to show you two projects which we built or finished last year. One is a single family house, and the other one is also a single family house, but it's a converted project in Cologne. It's not in Tel Aviv or in Frankfurt. The one is in Mönchengladbach, which is a small town in Germany, and the other one is in Cologne, which is a bigger city in Germany. I'm going to start with, wait, yeah, now it works. Okay, with Haus am Taköterbruch. This project we built or we finished last year, 2020, and end of 2020. The location, this is Mönchengladbach. The single family house is located in the Gießenkirchen district of Mönchengladbach, which is there. It's the red mark. This is like a small village in Mönchengladbach, which is a very typical German village structure, as you can see, with a street which goes through. And there are like a lot of houses which are at the street.
Straßendorf.
Straßendorf. Street village, I don't know how you call it in English. And there was our plot. This is the view from the plot before the house was built. There we marked like the scale of the house on the plot in this red marking lines. Here I have a few project drawings. First of all, this is the project we built. It's like a cross project. The single family house is located in the Gießenkirchen district of Mönchengladbach. The northwest facade borders on a nature reserve, which is here. The buildings in the surrounding village are of heterogeneous character. But you can see actually, you can't see it, but there is, you can believe me, there is a heterogeneous character of this village. When designing the house, the priority was to create a relationship between the living space and the landscape. This is how the first long house and the generous opening in the facade came about. This is the first long house. The living hall extends along the entire length of the house on the ground floor. On the left and the right side of the hall, functional niches accommodate serving rooms, kitchen, fireplace, work area, cloak room, WC, etc. At the front, the living hall leads into the garden and it closed off by a terrace overlooking the landscape. This is the terrace, and there you have like the landscape space. The longhouse is crossing by a second smaller house. It's this one. You can see it here on the plot. This is the second smaller plot. Second smaller house. Vertical access and sanitary rooms, as well as the entrance, are to be found at the intersection of the two houses, which is actually here, and here is the staircase. And in the basement, there are 2 storage rooms, a laundry room and a house's mechanical rooms. The house was constructed conventionally as a double shell masonry with a facing shell of clinker brick, which you can see also in the drawings. This is the project. This is the big opening in the facade, which lets the landscape space actually into the house, which was the first idea. And the second crossing house is also to have a kind of connection between the surrounding heterogeneous houses. In the traverse direction, the intersection blends the rigids of the adjacent development. In the longitudinal direction, it creates a connection to the more distant wider space. Accordingly, the oak windows, while allowing light to enter, still close the facade off on the long side more or less hermetically. On the 2 sides of the long house, they form large continuous surface that let the landscape permeate through on both stories. This is the front facade. There is like a big gap to let the rainwater in, actually, which goes along the whole street. These are the long facades, which have very, very small openings just to let a little bit light in. This is the entrance. And this is also the terrace where we can have the view to the landscape. And here, from these parking places, you can have also a view to the landscape. This is the terrace. And this is like a photo from the landscape, horses and this village structure. There's some photos from the inside. This is the entrance hall. On the right side, you have like the landscape, and on the left side is the backyard of the house. This is the view from the inside. And this one also. And this inner carpenter work, this is like almost the same like the facade in a way, but in the same proportion and in the same size of the openings. It's the upper floor, also the hall. There is like the cross section of the 2 houses, which you can see also on the ceiling of the house in the upper hall. And there is the view from the bedroom, actually. Here also. And now the second project. Umbau eines Wohnhauses auf der Kellenischer Straße in Köln. It's the name of the project. Or maybe I'm gonna rename it to Greenhouse or Grünes Haus or something like this. We talk about with Oliver about the name. And I guess Greenhouse is also a very beautiful name. Location. This is Köln right after the war, which is also by when you do a conversion project in Cologne, which is a city which was almost completely destroyed. It has a lot of complex constructive complexities actually, because you never know what they use after a war for materials, and it's a kind of, it was really very hard also with the engineers and for us, because when you open a wall, you see that they use some material what they found actually. That's why it's a bit complicated to do those kind of projects in Cologne or in some parts of Germany. This is Cologne. The converted house is located in the Zollstock district of Cologne, which is in the south of Cologne. A house in an intact block development opposite the southern cemetery. Here is the south symmetry of Cologne. Not in the middle of the city, but not completely outside it either. So its aim was to give the house a sense of the city center, which is neither very distant or very close, and to bring it closer. On the ground floor, a single continuous space was created from the entrance to the garden side. It's Cologne. There is also the location of the symmetry, the Rhine. The house on the left side before we finished it. Actually, it was like the first days of the construction site. Project dogs. The situation plan of the house. You see, this is like a very intact place, like in urban planning and teams of urban planning. On the left side, you have like how it was before, and on the right side, what we did actually. Here is like isometric drawing of the house. This is the first floor. Yeah. On the ground floor, a single continuous space was created from the entrance to the garden side, which is this, and this is like as a one whole space. The characteristic urban element of the colonnade was incorporated to this continuous space, which is this one. Thus, this continues the idea of a street, a public path through the house. The kitchen and living and dining rooms lead off from this corridor, similar to a small squares in a city. These are like the small squares in the city, and this is the colonnade. The floor plan was thus rearranged, giving the interior the character of an urban space. The colonnade leads to an enclosed private garden room, which is this here. Facing away from the street, passing the house, it emphasizes a domestic retreat in close connection with one's own piece of nature. The rooms on the first floor, a master bedroom with bathroom, a children's room, and another bathroom were redistributed. To aim was to achieve a greatest possible clarity and generously on the relatively small floor area. In the attic, there is a guest room and another children's room. The previous bitumen facade, imitating a brick bond, was removed and replaced by a simple plaster facade. In this way, the house, in terms of its external materiality, was reintegrated into the raw of surrounding houses. The plinth was given a dark green color, the facade a lighter mint green color. This maintains the color diversity. Diversity of the Kendelischer Straße or street, while preserving the individual color character of each house. The openings on the facade were redesigned materially and proportionally. The arrangement changed in the sense of the new floor plans. The natural tone of the oak window stands out against the green color of the plaster. Raised flaps give the windows clear outlines and lead plasticity to the facade. The entrance door was surrounded by a small portico. It provides rain protection and encloses the bell and letterbox. At the same time, it represents a welcoming gesture towards the street. A round window was added to the upper part of the facade, strictly framing the view of the greeny opposite. The defining elements of the front facade, doors and windows, stand out, arranged axially with great clarity. Their geometry is simplified, almost abstract. And if, in the sense of the architectural vernacular, They summarize familiar and generally understandable motifs that are able to evoke a certain cultural anchored idea of domesticity. This is the colonnade from the inside. These are the staircases. The view to the staircase from the kitchen. This is the whole space, which is actually just one space, which is just like juxtaposition. It's spatial separated actually. And this is the situation in the at the Kennische Straße. Thank you very much.
That was an interesting take on, I especially like the greenhouse, on transforming house, which reminds me from the size of it of Neues Frankfurt, and giving it a very different inside, definitely, and from the outside different color, and playing with traditional elements like the columns and making a completely new space, and talking about respect. And when we talk about respect for the different styles which we discussed briefly right now, and it would be interesting, how do you see, Feyyaz, your reference for, let's say, the greenhouse? What was your reference in opening up the inside and adding the little window? So do you take the reference from the tradition of columns, or do you rather say, okay, what about the space and what do I want to achieve with it? Back in a minute.
Actually,
Andrea? Er ist verwirrt, weil du eben nicht mehr im Bild bist.
So. Sorry.
I mean, you mean in the design process, how we, if we, it's actually very, almost impossible to describe. I mean, we work with a lot of references, and sometimes we have like a wall where we print some references and put it on the wall. And there are a lot of historical references also, but the motivation, first of all, is how to connect actually the inner space to the urban space. Mm-hmm. And then we start to think about how we can do this. And this was at the first project, was it like the same strategy, let's say, which allows us to design this big hall, which is for us in a metaphorical way, like also a landscape space, but which is in the inner space, and it's a living hall or something like this. And in this project, which is very close to the city, but not really close to the city, we had the motivation to think about how you can connect it more to the city. This is a very conceptual way to design a house, I know, but we thought that could work out somehow, because the first reference was actually the Nolli plan by Giambattista Nolli in Rome, the section where you can see the combination of the piazzas and the inner church spaces, which is somehow continuous in the inner space with a ceiling, and the piazza is without a ceiling, but there is not a real differences between them. And this was a kind of also a big reference for us to design this house, where we use this very city typology of a colonnade in the inside of the house.
It also reminds that typology of what you just talked about, street and space, and yes, in a building. It's very much like our museum at the where we sit right now. Also, almost built little streets, which are the staircases, and then we enter into a square, which is the exhibition space. So it's quite, that reference sounds very familiar to me, I have to say. That's also interesting. So we have opened up tonight with a broad, long, broad picture of different styles, where Zvi also talked about the central role of architects in the nation building, in how the model state is being referenced with a certain style. And I was wondering also, when we think about modern architecture, which we here in Frankfurt kind of rediscover, I would say, also with, of course, exhibitions here at the German Architecture Museum. And what also Zvi said, that until the 80s or 90s, nobody cared about, the modern architecture was not so much respected. And now we're back into respect. Oh, now we have actually the architecture. What is happening here? What is with the light? I'm sorry, I'm kind of blue.
Red?
Red?
Red? I mean, the face is quite...
Sorry, I try to get back to the discussion, but okay, things happen. And the question was, did modernism die, or is it being resurrected now with our aims here in Frankfurt to uphold the Neues Frankfurt-Siedlung so that it becomes a World Heritage estate, and maybe also in the proceedings, as your project fair shows, it goes back to modern or even more older references. How can we ensure, or where do we stand today with the modernism? What do you think? And where will we proceed in the future, let's say with brutalism, international style? Is it a natural thing that looking back, let's say 60 years, and then you finally find to appreciate a certain style, or has it more to do with our perception as a modern or super modern society today to understand that for our identity that we need to preserve some things? What do you think? Nobody.
Okay. You ask me or?
No, I asked anybody participating in our discussion. Sorry, I was not precise for that, but feel free to yes, it can also be Inbal or Zvi or Sharon. I see. Hello, Sharon. Good to see you. Also joining our discussion. Or Iran, I'm sure you also have some thoughts about this.
Okay, just to begin with perhaps a bit more provocative perspective. Well, the question is, what's really the cultural position or the cultural weight of architects or architectural culture today? Is it not that the market forces are those determining the survival of certain histories of architecture? I would say that it's the neoliberal economy or the neoliberal logic that propels the gentrification process and the added value of the real estate, of the property, and creates, at least if I look at the case of Tel Aviv, this is certainly the case. What we see is basically that all those kind of modernist buildings just increase their value, and this has a lot to do with the market forces. Of course, we can claim, of course, that the initial framing or rhetorical framing or academic framing was coming from architects or from architectural historians and so on. But what we see is that the real forces are those market forces.
Oliver.
Yeah, and I thank you, Andrea, for this. I mean, you raised these two questions: where do we stand? Where do we stand today, and how do we look at the past? I would say, but yeah. First of all, I want to thank really to Inbal and Zvi, and also for Fayas, of course, for their contributions. And I mean, I made some notes, and I want to maybe get back to their presentations in a way. Because Inbal, you said that so you raised the question if modernism has died in a way. I mean, it's a big question, of course, and I would say no matter how we stand towards this certain certain issue, we could say that nowadays, I mean, we simply lost our faith in progress, I would say. And so this is also kind of has also a reaction in architecture. So it's no longer possible to say honestly what is new in architecture and what comes next. And so I mean that is more or less the most postmodern aspect of our today's architecture discussion, that we are in the situation where we have no idea what is progress and what is a new thing, and how where the development is going to. And I would say that in all the times of modern architecture, they know exactly that architecture will solve any problem you could ever imagine. And so this is kind of remark towards the modernist issue. And then I asked myself, I mean, Inbal, you talked about cultural appropriation, and also Zvi did. And I thought, I mean, what is, I mean, maybe we can stay for at least a few minutes in this kind of cultural comparison thing, and I asked myself, what is the cultural appropriation in German architecture? What is appropriated? Is there anything appropriated? And so it reminds me a bit when Fayas did his presentation. I had this feeling that both of his houses, they kind of dream of another situation. They dream of a kind of Germany that is more related to the south. I mean, he mentioned the Nolly plan, this opening to the public spaces, and this kind of opening up the house to a public sphere. And so it's a kind of, and also the first house you presented, it's a kind of vernacular Palladio, or it's a kind of pastoral classic, I would say. And this house also dreams of not standing in Mönchengladbach near this countryside you described, it, which might be quite beautiful, but it reminds me of a bit of a dreaming of a more southern atmosphere and of a more southern landscape. And so, I mean, how the whole, and this brings back this kind of cultural appropriation. What do we wish to appropriate? And German architecture, I mean, Western German architecture in post-war times, I mean, there was this strong dream of appropriating the American lifestyle and the American architecture. And there were some travelings of German architects to the States, and they brought back the curtain wall idea, and they were so proud that they kind of renewed the system and made a more intelligent floor plan in the Dreischeibenhaus in Düsseldorf. I mean, HPP, they were convinced that they did a better job than the Americans did, but without the Americans, they would never have reached this kind of microphone, sorry. Yeah, and so this is kind of my contribution to this question of how to compare this what we might have seen as a description of Inbal and Zvi, and how to relate this to the German historiography. First of all, yeah, and so I need to fix my microphone.
Does anybody want to just jump in and reply to Oliver? Because I think he made a very interesting points for our discussion.
Yeah, I can try and reply. I mean, yeah, I think these are very important points. And what you mentioned about the curtain wall brought me to thinking last year, Jeffrey Lieber published a book about American modernism called Flintstone Modernism, where he asks, I think, a very potent question about what goes on with the modernism that is not mainstream, specifically in his book in the United States, that is not curtain wall or not, I don't know, the international style as it was interpreted in the United States. And I think with cultural appropriation, this is probably one of the points that we need to discuss. I mean, I showed a building that is a very, now I would say, rather well-known example of public buildings, you know, a mixed-use dwelling office public building. But I think we also need to pay attention to the to what doesn't exactly fit this frame. And this is how I think we can maybe also answer what you talk about with regard to Germany, because in our era, I think we have, like, there are so many references that architects rely on, and so many cultural references. And one of the things I think that maybe help us answer these questions about the move between the modernism that is dead or not is again to recontextualize it in culture and in what goes on with the States, because I think in Germany too, probably 20 or 30 years ago, what Fayaz showed might not have been that acceptable, because maybe, I don't know, too traditional, too postmodern. I think our interpretations really change with time. And it's the same thing in Israel. You know, 20 years ago, nobody would have thought about brutalism as something that is worthwhile listing. And I want to relate to what Jörg commented here on the chat or asked is, Jörg is asking about this. Okay, so if, at least in the maybe more narrow, how do you say, culture of historians and conservators, etc., we are aware of the value of brutalism, but then what he asks is, we still end up with brutalism being either demolished, and even if it's listed, it's completely covered with new buildings, and what can we do with that? And so I'm trying to sort of bring in both these perspectives. I think that, of course, discussion like we're having now is really important. But again, I think to contextualize it actually in its historical moment can maybe help us, you know, with understanding cultural appropriation and moving forward with this. And the last thing I want to comment about at this point is I think that one of the biggest changes, in addition to society and politics that have changed, is actually technology. Because when we look at the interwar modernism or post-war, and then what happens afterwards, I think one of the biggest changes have been technologies and how architects are using the new, you know, digital technologies to create new cultural appropriations. And I think this is one of the differences that we can point to between what was then and what is now, and our relationship to the past. It's very, very cultural and very, I agree with Tzvi, it's very, very market-led in nowadays. But I also think it depends on the really amazing and interesting, I mean, I find it very, very interesting, all the technological changes that are taking place that I think also in the end have a really big impact on these issues, whether they're visual or cultural. Visual, I mean, in the sense of a style, and is it brick or is the window, you know, round, or etc.
Thank you, Inval. There we have Jörg now, real in color and with a picture. Jörg, you want to join in? And it's just a question if we can hear you.
Yes, I wanted to share. Sorry.
You have an echo. Maybe one of the microphones needs to be closed.
You're twice in Zoom, and I think you have to leave one of them.
Double identity.
Double identity. You know, that's
only one, not two of them.
Ancient Jörg in two.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now it works fine. Excellent, without the echo. Thank you.
I can't hear anybody now, but if you can hear me, I want to share a question I ask myself. That is the definition of modernism, late modernism, postmodernism, brutalism, and if we accept it or not, or when do we accept it and when do we reject it? Is this today an urgent question and criteria? I think that the question of energy saving and the ecological challenge is much more altering our attitude towards architecture, towards brutalist architecture, towards postmodern architecture than ever before. So it's not only or not primarily an aesthetic question how to interpret historic architecture, but to keep it, and to think about a culture which is not defined as new architecture, but as rebuilding, as retrofitting, you can call it, changing it, but keeping it, and strive for continuity instead of replacing, get rid of and replacing every generation. So I think today we have also to discuss this question, and the question if heritage conservation can play a role or can contribute to a change of the attitude towards architecture and towards our built environment.
If I can relate to Jörg, is it okay? Can I?
Of course, go right ahead.
Can I take it? Okay.
Yes, of course.
Okay, Jörg, thank you for this comment. It's very much to the point, and I would just like to support it and to continue it. I absolutely agree, but I think that we can have some fun with the old terms, modernism, postmodernism, brutalism. Why not? As long as we play with it and we argue about it, we fight about it. I think that as a starting point, it's okay. But I absolutely agree with you that it is the specific qualities of perhaps of each historical period or those artifacts from our 20th century history that we have to work with. And one of the qualities of brutalism, and I would like to think that this is one reason why brutalism will have another kind of cycle, at least of interest, if not another cycle of sort of revival, is precisely because brutalism, at least the kind of brutalism that I'm talking about, say in Israel, has a lot to do with, for example, with passive architecture or with climatically specific buildings, and with certain notions of materiality, even sometimes with sort of crafting the surfaces of buildings, certain notions of plasticity and so on. So brutalism, of course, has a range of things that you call ethical, but not exactly ethical in the sense that Rainer Benha perhaps meant it, but in the sense that we today understand the urgency of looking at certain environmental and climatic issues. And the fact that we're talking many times about very intelligent architecture that has to deal with passive buildings or buildings that do not rely necessarily on mechanical systems, and they have to do their own shading, ventilation, and so on, and to work with the sites or landscapes in a very particular way. At least they have to be particular. At least they're about idiosyncrasy in terms of their own conditions, physical conditions. I think that this is one of the most important lessons we have to take from brutalism. On the other hand, we also have to remember that concrete as a material has many problems, and concrete as a material is something that at least from our current perspective of ecology is, let's say, debatable, okay, as a material, as a building material. So we do have here issues, a lot of issues to discuss when we talk about brutalism in general. For me, it's not only brutalism, it's other buildings from the 20th century. But yes. I totally agree with you that, yes, yes, Jürgen.
May I reply, Zvi, because you mentioned the term and the problem of concrete and of cement as an ecological problem and burden for us. But as far as I know, if we keep concrete buildings, we achieve much more than we replace badly concrete buildings or concrete architecture, which is looked upon to be ugly, to be non-appropriate, because we save this energy which is already there, and we do not replace it by new concrete buildings which are damaging our environment. That is why
I absolutely agree with you. And by the way,
we have to keep it. We have to keep all these concrete buildings. We cannot
destroy the bunkers. Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. Listen, and this is what I'm doing in my own practice, in my own office. We do that exactly. We preserve concrete buildings and we make these arguments. And the demolition of buildings in general is a huge problem. The problem of debris and so on. No, I absolutely agree with you. And these are central issues. But really, I really loved your point. I think it was well taken. That we're not really interested in the procession of styles, and the precise definitions of styles. This is no more an issue. It's for us, it's sort of an intellectual game for us historians, but it's not really an issue, and it's certainly not a precise science, an exact science. The point is really what we would like to take from this recent history of the 20th century. And in this sense, our attitude in itself is postmodernist because it's always relativist. It's always case specific. So it's not generalized. It's not dogmatic or ideological in the modernist sense. It cannot be anymore. It's much more complex, fragmented, oftentimes contradictory. Like this case of brutalism, we have a problem maybe with concrete, but we have so many qualities that we would like to discuss, to learn, and maybe to preserve. So this kind of complexity is something that really characterizes our time and our responsibilities, both as architects and as academics. I really like your perspective, and I totally support it.
Yeah, I just want to. I mean, I can also 100% agree that it's necessary to keep. To keep all the buildings we already have, no matter if they are modernist or brutalist or postmodernist. I mean, every destruction means a waste of energy and a waste of gray energy, and we should, when we think of the climate crisis, we should keep everything that we already have. And so, I mean, relating to kind of this style game, as Zvi,
but keep or preserve. That's different.
This kind of style game is a kind of intellectual pleasure, but it's also a kind of, I mean, from our museum perspective. I think certain kinds of buzzwords, they mobilize a certain kind of audience. I mean, when you speak about brutalism, everybody gets kind of either on one side or on the other side. Either they love it or they hate it. And so it's a kind of, I would always say, it was always a kind of tactical element to say SOS brutalism. And so, I mean, when we have said SOS post-war architecture, nobody would have ever come to the show. And so, and you're definitely right. It's necessary to establish a certain narrative. And for instance, we brought the exhibition to a small town near Stuttgart that is called Aalen. And in Aalen, they have a town hall they called Ahlen's battleship, because it sits in this kind of old town like a battleship. It was, by the way, it was the last work of the mayor after a long term of being mayor, and he started in the Nazi time. And he was still mayor in the post-war years. And as his last final action, he established this much too big city hall. And now they have they asked themselves, should they keep it or should they kind of build something new? And we went there with the show, and it is absolutely necessary to go there and to speak exactly about the qualities, about the craft tradition, but about the handrails, about the way the concrete is casted, and also about this kind of this. And then I'm getting more political in the way of architecture, not only speak about concrete and the details. It's also necessary to say that it's such a high quality to have a town hall that has a generosity of space, and it offers the space to the people of this town. And so that is the main quality of this architecture, that it offers something to the public. And I mean, I would say in a worldwide comparison, I mean, among the best brutalist buildings, they are always public buildings. It was the public hand that built it. It was not a kind of, I mean, there were some examples of commercial architecture as well, but it was more a kind of public architecture. And with this rediscovery of brutalism, we should make a political argument to say it's necessary to get back the public hand in the business of architecture, I would say.
That's an excellent point. So Iran wants to make a point, and Sharon as well.
Thank you, Andrea. I had three short points I wanted to say, and I will start with the last one because it relates a bit to the terms ugly and beautiful that were mentioned now regarding the destruction of buildings. So I think this ugly and beautiful is being used more and more in the let's say in the conversations about which heritage we should keep. And unfortunately, the concrete buildings are and brutalist buildings are big victims of this language. And this language is a lot of time is not being used by people who are, let's say, in the profession, but by the decision makers. And finally, the decision makers are the ones who are determining a lot of the fate of these buildings. I will just, if possible, will share an image of the. Do you see?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Yeah.
What is it? What is it?
This is the building it's a concrete building of the custom house in Jaffa, built in the 30s and was demolished just less than a year ago. With one of the reasons for the demolition was because it's ugly. Not even referring to, or it was referred, but it was not one of the main issues why to keep the building, was regarding its values, heritage, what it used to be, what was its function in the port of Jaffa, in the history of Jaffa, in the history of, let's say, immigration to Israel and Palestine. So regardless to all those things, the main one of the main discussions was, is it ugly or not? And this is one of the last unfortunate victims, I think, of this language which is being used in this case. So that was my first remark, and I also could refer to that. because there is a discussion now about two buildings in Tiberias, which is a city in the periphery near the Lake of the Galilee, and while trying to convince the local municipality to save or to keep their heritage, they use the terms ugly or improper buildings in order to justify their destruction. So this is one point that I wanted to say. The second point was I was intrigued by the image that Oliver had brought of the demolition of the historical museum in Frankfurt.
Yes, it was the historic museum in Frankfurt.
Yeah, and I thought that the image was intriguing, mostly because of the building which is standing there, and this timber frame building, which is probably kind of standing indifferent to the destruction of the building next to it. And probably this building was preserved or rebuilt, or I don't know. I've been once in Frankfurt, but I don't remember. Probably it's in the city center, this site, and this kind of sort of a dilemma or irony that the building which was referred to the timber building is being demolished. First, I'm intrigued, and I would like to hear the story how the concrete brutalist building is connected to the wood frame building, and then to see that this kind of layer in the city, which was maybe in a very strange way influenced by the history of the city, was not being kept, or was not kept. It was taken away, and maybe now it's being replaced by a kind of imitation of old city center. I don't know if it is like that there, but I think there are cases like that buildings are reconstructed over these concrete buildings, and they try to imitate a false past. And the last remark is regarding to inbounds, and I really thought it's important she was pointing out the regional and the local aspect of the brutalist architecture in Beersheba or elsewhere. But I think this reference to locality and what Carmi was at least saying he was influenced from could be experimented and realized mostly in the periphery and not in the center. And this is the very specific and important point regarding this architecture, which was developed in the periphery, and Beersheba is a periphery. But in the past, it was sort of a laboratory for architecture, and therefore this kind of brutalist architecture, which is experimental and also taking from the local ideas, could I think being realized there, while maybe in the center of the country in Tel Aviv, the internationalism of architecture was more conventional in some ways. And ironically, I think today in the periphery, it is much more difficult to conserve heritage and let's say experimental heritage. And we could see also in the other image in Balbrot of even not demolishing the Negev center, it is being completely or shattered by the new development. And this is kind of an irony that today it's very difficult to protect those buildings over there, while in the center of the country, or in Tel Aviv mostly, it is much more progressive in the way it protects this kind of heritage. So thank you all for your inspiration for some comments.
Thank you, Eran.
But Eran, if I just make a quick, Ran, I totally accept what you say about the periphery in Israel and as a ground for experimentation, at least in the 50s and 60s, kind of we find a lot of radical architecture or radical, let's say, brutalist experiments, sometimes in the periphery, but we also find them in the center, and the same architects. Rami Karmi, for example, is doing his Amal school, which is certainly not less radical or experimental or even kind of regional or local than the building in Beersheba. So yes, the point is that at the same time, the 50s and 60s, almost everything was kind of peripheral. Even the north of Tel Aviv was peripheral, maybe to the center of Tel Aviv, or Bat Yam, which is the center, but it was already peripheral. And then we can see the very radical works of the Tzvi Hecker and Neumann Hecker, Sharon, and other people. So we find basically Israel is perceived as peripheral, ideologically as peripheral for a time. And you're absolutely right that nowadays, and this is of course your issue professionally to deal with, that somehow to find a way to tell this story to the people so they are convinced that what they have is valuable. This is the point, and it's not about beauty, beautiful or ugly. It's about a value that they have there, and they have to be convinced that it is so. And this is our task as architects and and educators to do it. And I think that the situation is getting better. It's getting better. More people, at least the younger generation, appreciate brutalism and modernism. It's getting slightly better. Again, it's market forces in the end that determine what's happening. But I think that it's getting slightly better, and we'll have enough. At the end of the day, we'll have, I hope, enough brutalist buildings left to tell us the story of the 20th century, brutalist and modernist and postmodernist.
Thank you, Tzvi. Sharon.
Yes, well, connecting to what Tzvi just said, I think the story is really what it's all about, because I find that conservation, as we do it now in the city, is really a physical manifest of what the city itself wants to tell, their own story, its own narrative in a way. And in Israel, of course, we cannot detach this sort of brutalist style from the welfare state. And this is very important because the modernist buildings that were built before were usually on very small plots and usually privately owned. And then the welfare state comes and really builds those big, beautiful, bold buildings. And what I want to refer to is really the sort of Noli plan. If you look at it, like mentioned before, that there was a lot of thought about public space or sort of a semi-public space, which is also integrated into those buildings, which I find very, very interesting and important, especially now, maybe even post-pandemic. We should look at those public spaces in the city or this historic urban landscape in a much broader way than just looking at one building, beautiful or not, but rather the whole context of the city at large. And for me, in particular, those sort of urban spaces are very important. Maybe if we regard also what Tzvi has mentioned, that capitalism plays a big role in how a city develops or how it regenerates itself. So I think we as the regulator or the conservation architect have to say now that those buildings are important, because in order for the process to happen, it takes sometimes a decade, at least in Tel Aviv, until the regulation really can take care of those buildings. So I find that declaring them now is very, very important, because, if you look at Tel Aviv, there's not a lot of space to build, and those buildings are usually on big plots and very wanted plots, because you can build high rises on top of them or demolish them and build high rises. So this is why now I think we're in a critical point of time regarding keeping those buildings. That's it from my side. Thank you.
I just wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I want to ask the question if we can kind of, where do we start? I mean, we all do a kind of, we have a cultural agenda. We try to convince people doing the right things. And I would say, I mean, what is more in our reach? Is it manipulating market forces? I mean, there are strong market forces, of course, or is it in our reach to kind of convince more architects to act more like activists, I would say. I mean, I always have the feeling that many architects, they wait for that chance, they wait for the competition, but none of them ever tells that the question in the competition was wrong. It's wrong to say build a new building instead of in transferring an old one. And so the whole process, how architectural decisions are prepared through this kind of negotiation about possible ways. I mean, in a very early moment, you have to say it's always better not to demolish, and it's always better to repair, and then you have the whole setup changed. And I think we need more a kind of architectural task force that takes care about all those things instead of waiting for the chance to make a contribution in a public competition where the question is completely deeply wrong.
I think that intellectual activity still has a central role in this, because, you know, we were saying that the definitions maybe are not important, but I think they are important in exactly the sense to create and nurture the narrative. And I think they should, of course, be, you know, constantly questioned and unsettled, because, like, I think we had some really good examples today of how these definitions are fluid, but I think the intellectual discussion has a role, both with the market forces and especially with architects. I mean, at least in Israel, I think there's a lot of work to be done in how we work with architects and, like you say, and persuade them and into these task force that speak for adaptive reuse. And it doesn't necessarily go against building new. These things will always exist side by side. But I agree with what everyone said, that adaptive reuse has to have a very central role in how we shape the cities of the future, and of course protection and conservation are an important part of that. And like Sharon was saying, I think maybe one of the keys, and that goes back to what Yor was asking, is to try to see how we can speed things up. Because by the time we manage to create an intellectual debate or influence architects or influence the market, somebody has come along and destroyed or whatever they do with these really sought after real estate plots.
That's a very good point. I think poorness is a very good conservator in general. And as soon as money walks in, a lot more changes are happening a lot faster. And I think the question of time when talking about preserving buildings or defining which buildings add to the narrative of a city, like the White City in Tel Aviv or the Neues Frankfurt here in Frankfurt, I think that's a very vital question. And that is very good to consider also for future, currently already standing buildings, and how to add to the narrative of a city. Because I think what we're talking also about the lack of identity of inner cities. They became interchangeable. They're bland. They have always the same shops, or mostly here in Germany. You walk from one middle-sized town to another, you find the same shops. So you lose the narrative, you lose the identity of a city. And I think that's a very good point when thinking about how to build again an identity of a city, an identity of place, of home, of to really add this conservation aspect, or to add the aspect that these buildings are valuable because they're valuable signs of the time, and are also still valuable because they add to the identity of a city. And I think that's a very important aspect when thinking about World Heritage or any monument protection or keeping a building. And I agree also with Inbar, we need to be faster in that sense, to be ahead of the wave and not after the wave and come with a narrative when it's too late. Okay, anybody else who wants to speak a few words to add to the discussion, or do we leave this and say we become faster, we think more about narratives in the city, and it doesn't actually matter if it's a brutalist or modernist or postmodern building, as long as it adds to the diversity or to the idea of cities? Because I think that's very, at least for my thinking, when I think about, okay, how to proceed with the Neues Frankfurt, to consider that point more in the future. In Frankfurt in general, I mean, there's a lot of replacement. I mean, on the other hand, we just rebuild our new old town to become again more specific, which is exactly the point. We destroyed the town hall, which was not brutalist.
Somehow it was, yeah, I would say.
Somehow it was. And we turned even further back and said we want to have the old town back as the heart of Frankfurt, to add to a narrative which was kind of missing to a lot of people here in Frankfurt.
That is because Frankfurt is not as poor as the conservators should be, as you told, to save it and to keep it. So they had the money to rebuild old Frankfurt and to replace everything which what has been created in the post-war period, and where we had our walking tours too. These were touristic, or for students it were destinations we saw there. But I think that, so it's a question of money. But I would add a last question, which we have not to discuss or to answer, but I think it's very important. He said, or he underlined, that he said you have to keep it. And as far as I understood him, there is a difference between preservation and keeping something, and restoring something and conserving something and reuse. And so the question is, what is the role of heritage conservation in this whole process? In Germany, for example, there are about 3% of the buildings, of the historic buildings, of the existing buildings, only 3% are listed. So it's not of any importance from a statistical point of view or from a numeric point of view. What are you doing with this 3%? But it is, I think it's a very high, let's say, an educational potential, because there you can show how these kind of buildings, which are looked upon as ugly or which are not as estimated, how they can be not only kept, but how they also can be evaluated and re-evaluated for people. And I think this producing of model roles in the listed building stock, that can be of importance, because the society needs to be convinced. And so when we are discussing, for example, energy saving and heating and insulation and so on, you can say many good examples have been created in kind of pilot studies or of pilot projects by conserving listed monuments. And that is why it is important to think also about this 3% and to think together with architects, what do you expect? What is the role of conservationists not to create old Frankfurt Juli, but to keep the word and to yes, to improve the situation. And there, I think there we should discuss what is only an ecological reason for keeping old buildings or structures, and what is the cultural discussion, and what could play this kind of model role, how to perceive and how to deal with historic buildings, because I think that's the challenge today. It's in our regions, at least, it's the challenge. Maybe in other regions worldwide, it's different.
I think that's a very valid question, and something to ponder about when we end for tonight. And maybe we can discuss it when we meet in real life here in Frankfurt, which I still want to schedule. I'm still optimistic. I still haven't set a date, but I really hope that we can manage to do that, to have a meeting here in Frankfurt, maybe not in the Architecture Museum, because our building will be renovated, and to get new energy efficient things. We get the new windows. But in the end, it will look like it looked before, hopefully. That's the idea. And we will close this house by end of September and leave it for 2 years approximately. And then we will be back with a better insulation and better climate inside, and a little bit more technical infrastructure being improved. But I hope we still manage to, we might not meet here, but we meet in Frankfurt in the future. That's the aim. And I thank you very much for participating in the discussion tonight and getting the different views on the different times and how can we proceed in the future. I think there's still so many things to discuss that I look forward to meet you all here. And thank you to the audience, who were listening in, and we will do a little publication of our discussions to get the highlights of all our discussions into a little PDF or even a little booklet, so that we can always refer to our discussions, not only watching the videos, but having a brief looks into the key points of our discussions. Thank you very much for cooperating, for being here. Thank you, Sharon and Jörg and Philip and Inbal and Eran, who were always participating and creating the ideas which we have discussed through the last 8 discussion evenings. And thanks to the Stadtplanungsamt here in Frankfurt and to the Project Nationale Stadtentwicklung, who made this entire discussion possible by funding our series. Thank you, and I say good night from Frankfurt. Good night, and good luck, and until soon in real life, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.